Safe and Sterile Endoscopes, a new series from Beyond Clean, where we dive into the seismic shifts redefining endoscope reprocessing today. It's hosted by me, Hank Balch. In this series, we'll unpack groundbreaking innovations, sterilization standards, and best practices transforming patient safety in real time. With insights from industry experts and frontline champions, we're here to help you navigate the complexities of endoscope reprocessing and sterility. This series is proudly sponsored by ASP, Advanced Sterilization Products, protecting patients during their most critical moments. And now, sit back and stay tuned for an eye-opening journey into the future of endoscope safety. Hey there, Sterile Processing Universe. My name's Hank Balch, and you're listening to the Safe and Sterile Endoscope series on the Beyond Clean Network, sponsored by Advanced Sterilization Products. And we are talking to Dr. Yvonne Salgo today, and we're wrapping up this 6-part series, talking about, of course, the sterilization of our endoscopes, not only in sterile processing, but also in the endoscopy process and workflow. Dr. Salgo, welcome to the show today.
Oh, hey, Hank. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak to your audience.
As I alluded, we've had already 5 fantastic episodes in this series. We've talked about the history of these very complex devices. We've talked about some of the trends that we're seeing out there. We've talked about the relationship between infection prevention and sterile processing and endoscopy. We've had a ton of great guests, a lot of great conversations. Today's episode is really to kind of turn us from what has happened to what is happening today and what the future of this industry and these workflows and devices are giving us. But before we jump into that, I do want to give the audience an opportunity to learn a little bit about yourself. You are the Chief Medical and Scientific Officer, Vice President, ASP. But where'd you come from? What's your background? How'd you get to where you are today?
Sure. In a nutshell, I've got a little bit of an eclectic background. I studied chemical engineering, so that's actually given me lots of foundation in terms of sterilization science and how sterilization works from a chemistry and a mechanical aspect. I'm a cardiothoracic anesthesiologist, so I was on faculty in Philadelphia, taking care of both patients in the operating room for heart surgery and heart and lung transplants, and also for surgical intensive care for those patients. So I have a lot of clinical experience perioperatively, and working in the ICU, a lot of experience on infection and healthcare associated infection. So I've spent my career connecting the dots between medical innovation as well as clinical practice. So today, hopefully it'll be okay with you. I'll mix in some of my clinical experience along with talking about the technology.
So what do you do in your current role? I know that we hear the term Chief Medical Officer in the clinical setting many times in hospitals, and so we kind of have an understanding of what that looks like in the hospital setting. But then that kind of Chief Scientific Officer as well. How do those blend, and what does that look like for you day to day?
Sure. Well, I have 3 roles, 3 areas of responsibility within ASP. One is working very closely with our regulatory and safety function, working with global regulatory and competent authorities. So helping to ensure that our products are safe, helping to ensure that we understand when there's reporting, what to do about it. And I actually have a team of clinicians that actually evaluate safety, because safety is number 1, is paramount. The second is I work, that's internally. Externally, I work visiting hospitals, talking to clinical staff. And honestly, what I view my mission now, having come to ASP as a physician, is really to connect with other physicians, especially be they gastroenterologists, anesthesiologists, surgeons. I really want to get the word out there about what sterile processing is, because I know that that's an important area for my physician colleagues to learn about. And then the last part was work very closely with my R&D partner in mapping our portfolio for innovation and new technology. So it's a busy role, it's challenging, but actually I have great fun doing it.
Yeah, well, that intersection, like you even alluded to before, that innovation piece is really important. Obviously, today there's a lot of changing shifts in technologies going on, but then you got that clinician population that needs to know about what's happening out there and can impact their day to day. So maybe let's start there. This entire season has kind of been moving to this point in episode 6 where we lay out and say, okay, there is a shift that's happening. There's a future that's going to hit us here. Well, it's already here, but there's a future that's coming in the clinical implications of sterile endoscope. So what has happened? What are those advancements in the technology and the process and the equipment itself that folks, like when you're talking to clinicians out there, that you're really putting kind of front and center?
Sure, absolutely. It's good even to underpin what the technology is doing and why the technology is important from a problem worth solving perspective. I think I'll underpin it with 2 or 3 things that have really happened over the last decade or more. You've talked about them, but I want to reemphasize them. So there are more multi-drug resistant organisms. Nature is really clever. We learned that in the pandemic, and bugs are constantly evolving. And not only are they evolving genetically, but they make things like biofilms, which help them actually resist the end-to-end process. I think it's important. That's a key start. So the germs that we're fighting are tougher, hardier, and harder to deal with. So that's one part of the challenge. The other is, having worked in medical device innovation for many years, is the devices are becoming more complex. Specifically, they have more channels, they have more forceps, they have more catheters, they're doing more, and that is very important from a Spaulding classification perspective, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then I think the other one, which is very sensitive for me, is there are more vulnerable patients than there were 20, 30 years ago. We have patients with cancer, we have transplant patients, we have patients with all sorts of autoimmune diseases. And basically, if you look on the media, you can see there's so many biologic and other types of chemo and immune therapies. So there's a much larger population of vulnerable patients. So when you bring that all together, working to help ensure that we can elevate the standard of care is the goal of what the technology is. And so the foundation of the technology is the same as it is for low temperature sterilization in the general operative setting, which is using hydrogen peroxide gas plasma to reach the nooks and crannies and to, I think, importantly, elevate the margin of safety. The more you do from an end-to-end process in terms of pre-cleaning, cleaning, as well as appropriate washing, and then adding sterilization adds to the margin of safety. Bringing all of these things together, and a big believer from a risk perspective of it's everything that we do. It's no one thing. And actually by making all these pieces come together, we elevate the standard of care. So that's it at a high level. I'm happy to go in to talk a little bit more about the technology. But hopefully I could mention one thing about the Spaulding classification. We know what non-critical instruments are because they touch intact skin. And we know what critical instruments are because they come in contact with the bloodstream. Actually, Dr. Rutala, when he writes about it, either I've got my trusty copy here of Mandel's Principle of Infectious Diseases. This is only volume 1, right? So he actually wrote the chapter in there. And he makes an important point about vascular compartment. He explicitly mentions critical items as coming into contact with the vascular compartment. And that just makes sense because the bugs can actually go mix with the bloodstream. And when you think about these patients, you can see that, oh, wait a minute, this is important. The Spaulding classification, and Dr. Rutala calls it a rational approach, which is it's completely logical, it's easy to remember, it's important. But it was developed over 50 years ago. And so he and others talk about actually evolving our view and use of it as these instruments become more complex. And so I think that is where the role of sterilization helps to come in. More and more of these endoscopic procedures are actually penetrating sterile tissue. You can see blood in the endoscope. I'm a TE guy. Even microlacerations happen. When I used to pull out a TE probe, once in a while, I would see little streaks of blood. That's the reality. So the idea that the gastrointestinal tract is sort of this perfect mucous membrane and cannot be injured and bugs cannot go in there is probably somewhat of an older concept.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that conversation. That's a raging conversation today in the IP corner of our industry, obviously in the sterile processing industry, around the Spaulding classification and their strong opinions and perspectives from every angle. But to your point, I think everyone understands, hey, this is a model that was built, many years ago, and there's been a lot of shifts that have occurred both on the guideline regulatory side of things, the complexity of devices you mentioned, and the bugs. And so all of those three things combined really means we all need to come back to the table and have some strong conversations about, how we need to move forward scientifically, based on evidence and not assumptions. You also
By the way, I think it's a good model, by the way. It's just we're blurring the lines now. That's the point.
You mentioned as well that innovation piece has been shifting substantially on the device side, but the change we're talking about for sterilizing endoscopes, that's not a new thing. The low temp sterilization modality has been in the industry now for many years. We've been low temperature sterilizing many devices. And so that part of the equation is just standard fare. But now moving some of these more complex devices into that modality, that is a shift. And a lot of things had to happen to make that possible. So let me maybe ask that question, because we've talked about this a little bit on the R&D episode, but from your perspective, of course, there's R&D that has to happen to make it possible. What else has to happen to change the modality availability to certain medical devices to take it from maybe what would be high-level disinfected prior to now make it possible to do low-temp sterilization?
Yeah, before even talking about the technology, let me talk to your point about two enabling points. One is the awareness, which is what you're doing on the podcast today. The other is working with multiple specialists and multiple specialty societies, organizations, working with infection preventionists, infectious disease physicians, gastroenterologists, even surgeons, working with perioperative leaders who actually are involved with hospital purchasing and hospital safety. Those could be any kind of physician, any kind of nursing officer. So one is to get the awareness out there. The second part is to understand also using a rational data-driven approach, which is what we've been talking about. If you noticed, I haven't contradicted the Spalding classification. Hopefully things that I'm sharing have good logical underpinning. So one is to reach out to all these groups, and the other is to bring rational data to actually have an open conversation about it. I think that's really important. I think the second part, though, is really getting intricately connected with the sterile processing community and gastroenterologic endoscope processing community, understanding their workflow. So if we get hospitals to understand what the clinical motivation is, I think the other important aspect is to understand, hey, there are ways to do this that actually can be easily or relatively easily facilitated with the sterile and disinfection processing community from a workflow perspective. Because, hey, it's great if it works, but what if we don't know how to use it, or what if we can't use it? So all of these things need to come together: appreciation of the knowledge, education, and an appreciation of workflow.
And there's one more aspect, maybe, and this is the next question here, is the economic realities. Because, yes, does it work? Do we know how to do it? Do we have access to the tech? Has all that been covered? And then at the bottom line, we have to sit down in that purchasing or that value analysis committee and say, okay, is this the route that we need to go, or that we can't afford to go as a health system? So what are your thoughts on, how clinicians today or how hospitals are dealing with this question around endoscopes? There's obviously options out there for single-use endoscopes. There's options to just stick with the status quo. And then there's options now to begin sterilizing endoscopes. How are folks working through the cost part of those analyses?
Yeah, so starting with that, I think it's important to recognize as I go across the United States and also travel across the world, there's definitely a variance. There are multiple different perspectives and experiences, depending on, for example, if someone has had an outbreak or a contamination at their hospital, the awareness is very high, and the economics to those individuals is there. I see multiple approaches. Ethylene oxide is being used, but it's got a carcinogenic potential. It's got a long drying time. And from an economic perspective, from an OR perspective, in terms of, or a GI suite perspective, in terms of case turnover, the long aeration times affect the economics of ethylene oxide over and above. Well, I should say health comes first and then the economics. But there are definitely institutions that I see that use ETO because they feel so strongly for the reasons that I mentioned. The single-use scopes also have had an important role, especially when I talk to hospitals that either have had outbreaks or I speak to infection preventionists. It's just standard practice from an infection prevention perspective. If we can use disposable equipment and it's economically viable, the bugs go into the waste along with the scope. But the economics, there are carbon footprint and landfill implications to single-use devices. There's one study that actually was published that single-use devices have about 11 kilograms of carbon. If you go the reusable route, it's a little bit less than 5 kilograms. But then the landfill, there are also studies on the landfill footprint. If you start to convert endoscopes to fully single use, there's a huge landfill implication. It can be 40% or more in terms of the landfill. And then there's some more, if you will, intangible aspects to the economics. In terms of the physicians who do the procedures, for example, I talk about my own experiences as a fellow. I learned how to do transesophageal echo or bronchoscopy, lung transplant bronchoscopy, manipulate airways. I learn on certain equipment, and my hands and brain develop certain muscle memory to the maneuverability. And I share with my colleagues who haven't done any endoscopy, you could blindfold me and I could tell you what equipment I was holding in my hand. And that's a harder economic, but if the physician says, yeah, I think I have better outcome, I think I can do the procedure faster with this instrument that I know and I'm used to, there's definitely a benefit to that from a quadruple aim perspective. Outcome, staff, and patient satisfaction, as well as costs, all these come together. Rather than take an absolute position, I kind of wanted to go and just tell you sort of the pros and cons of each.
Right. Well, that kind of leads naturally to if there's implications for that physician decision. And again, like sometimes that's not just based on hard numbers, right? There's a level of preference, but I spoke to someone a couple of years ago about physician preference and they made the point, hey, if this guy or this gal, if they're saving your life and they have a preference on the tools that they want to use to do that, yeah, you're going to say, I'm going to trust that preference, right? So it's not the kind of preference like I prefer this kind of food over this. Like there's a strategic preference there that has life-saving implications. So your point, very well taken, and I guess those intangibles, again, they're very hard to measure on that value analysis call sheet, but it does come into play if we're talking efficiency, if we're talking physician comfort, and ultimately outcomes, hopefully, would be the equation there. But my follow-up question to that is, like we talked a little bit on the environmental impact of it, but then there's also going to potentially be changes in our workflow. And this is not just the reprocessing workflow itself, because if you're changing scopes from high-level disinfection, you got a whole room set up, potentially for that process, that now you would either need to change that room and add a sterilizer, or maybe you would change the direction that those scopes are going into, like the GI reprocessing into the sterile processing department. There's a lot of different avenues there. So you can maybe speak to that. But then there's also a workflow turnaround change as well to how these scopes would be packaged, how they would be stored, just because of the different dynamics for this reprocessing. So kind of speak to how you see the market responding to those changes, and if you've had any questions or pushback along the way.
Right. Yes. So the workflow is key, right? So the potential benefit here is actually no long turnaround times as with ETO, less carbon footprint, and potentially less cost versus single use. And so those benefits, each of those has a particular workflow. And then to your point on the physician preference, they get to use it, he or she gets to use the scope that their maneuverability, muscle memory, it works. These are all very important benefits. In terms of the workflow overall, actually, I look at it from different tiers. Probably what I've learned actually working in industry, the world has learned a lot from Toyota Production Systems and from economies of scale. So as I mentioned, there's a variance of hospitals and what they do. Typically, in talking to hospitals about the workflow, I've seen some hospitals already that actually have a dedicated, quote unquote, GI central processing area that's actually not far from the clinic where they're actually doing the procedures, and there's actually a rapid turnaround. So these institutions are already set up for that. They feel very strongly, by the way, in elevating the standard of care And they're good examples of that. So the answer is for them, they've actually worked out transport. They've worked out the process. They've worked out trays in terms of what they do and how they work with a GI clinic. So a lot of that actually has already been worked out. A second possibility for hospitals that are actually climbing this journey and they're not quite at the same point where they have a dedicated processing facility near GI is just to have transport to a central processing facility. We're talking actually to the audience that understands both education and experience and how important that is to quality in sterile processing. And when you do it at scale in a large central processing facility, you've got all the process improvements, you've got all of the flow worked out. So if you don't have it right there, you can take it to central processing. And then the third possibility are smaller remote areas. And until they probably have the workflow to reach ERCP, they may not be as ready as the first two that I talked about.
Yeah, so we know prior to COVID, this conversation was one of the hottest conversations out there in the medical device space. COVID, I feel like, kind of interrupted a lot of things, but interrupted that conversation in particular. And so it's taken a while, from the height of, hey, this is a challenge that needs to be solved, to now we finally have solutions in the market today that can start solving this. What's your pulse on the speed at which we're going to continue to make inroads to continue to innovate in how we sterilize endoscopes, the number of models that we can sterilize, just that industry perspective on, today this is a new thing, but how much longer is it going to be a new thing until we're looking to, okay, this is the standard thing. And now we're looking at all these new innovations that could be coming in the market to help us to increase.
Yeah. So a few pieces to that. One is ASP in partnership with Pentax got FDA clearance on the use of their duodenoscope with the ASP Sterad this summer. I would say from a technology perspective, the innovation really is in the software design. So the sterilizer doesn't have to be swapped out from a hardware perspective. The cycle can actually be put on an existing 100 NX. So that in and of itself starts the conversation with, well, all those sterilizers that are out there, they can still be used. You don't have to do what they sometimes call as a forklift upgrade. So from a hardware perspective, that's one, I would say, really important part. The second is now that there's availability of the way to do this, keeping all of the benefits that we talked about in terms of muscle memory, but actually getting to that margin of safety with sterilization, that's real now with this. I think what's going to happen is the first area are as I said, hospitals from an innovation perspective, an adoption perspective, that have a lot of the higher risk patients. I thought about this as I just came back from the American College of Gastroenterology last week in Philadelphia. And what I thought about was, and I started to realize, I know it practically, but it really came top of mind, is when somebody pulls a scope out of a cabinet, it's going to a patient, you don't know the medical history of that patient. Yet there's literature actually that shows that if you're immune suppressed, you have cancer, or you're a liver transplant patient, you have higher exposure risk to complications. And so this was the aha moment for me. It's like, well, wait a minute. If I don't know, and I'm using the minimum standard of care for these high risk patients because I'm grabbing a scope, but I haven't seen yet a special area in the cabinet, for immunocompromised patients. And so when you think about that, actually, the idea that actually everybody should have access to an elevated standard of care is important. So that's the message, actually, that I'm realizing and is the road that we're on. So there are a few things at play here. I hope I've answered some of your questions on that.
Yeah. Let me ask you one more question here, Dr. Salgo, before we let you go. Clearly, there's going to be a first mover advantage to this because any innovators out there kind of chopping the trail out of the rainforest, but there's going to be folks that are following along behind you guys who say, okay, it is possible. Here's the way to do it. And to your last point there, these are all the reasons that we can't wait any longer. We've got these patients that need it. We got this industry that's ready. It's asking for it, that wants it. In the next 5-10 years, what else do you see coming down the pipeline in the industry at large, or maybe even from your team, that's going to address maybe those other challenges out there that have yet to be solved in this corner of the industry that we're working in?
Yeah, I think for this corner, but even in general, another area, of course, is coping with biofilms. So that's nature's way to outsmart what we do. So looking at new ways to actually address biofilms, devices and chemicals used to address biofilms, especially in endoscopy, I think is actually a very important area. I think another area is actually using various types of technologies to elevate quality control. There are multiple ways to do that without necessarily getting specific, doing it in partnership, using technology in partnership with actually the folks who are doing the sterile processing, actually by making their lives easier, that we know that helps improve quality. And so I think that is another key area. And then final point is that you brought up that I don't want to forget is actually doing the health economics of this in general. So I think what's going to happen more and more is we're going to start using health economics arguments as well, and risk. I was reviewing some papers this morning. The cost of cholangitis complication could be upwards of $100,000 if it includes a ICU admission. And we're talking about duodenoscopy and ERCP. So these, you can actually do math and you can do risk calculations. And I would say that sterilization is important. Disposable end caps have been making inroads, but other parts of the endoscope can actually get contaminated as well. So the ability to actually sterilize all of the endoscope is really important. And I think the future will be, now that the pandemic is over, ways for us to embrace this, to continue to embrace this innovation.
Awesome. Dr. Salgo, thank you so much for your time today, but also thank you for your leadership and your entire team. You know, you wake up every morning and you go to work and you're looking to solve these very complex, challenging issues. I know it's not something that you can solve by yourself, but we can't solve it many times as clinicians. Like, we need someone to bring new technology, new software, new processes to us so that we can do our jobs better, safer, faster. It's a team sport, I guess is what I'm saying. So I really appreciate that.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely takes a team, and I really appreciate it. And I wholeheartedly sync with your comment on that.
All right, that was Dr. Ivan Salgo, the Chief Medical and Scientific Officer and Vice President at ASP. You're listening to the Safe and Sterile Endoscope series. This is a 6-part series on Beyond Clean, sponsored by ASP. So if you've missed any of the episodes, this is a 1, 2, 3 through kind of chronologically from the beginning of the endoscope all the way through what the future of this industry looks like, as we discussed in this episode with Dr. Salgo. So check out any episode that you missed along the way. They're all available on the Beyond Clean Network or anywhere podcasts are heard. And until we talk to you again, keep fighting dirty.